Now I'm at Cofa Mountain right now. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm getting prepared for a sunrise shoot. So I'm going to plan this out as if we're going to get the sun coming up behind the mountains, which we should do. For now, we're just going to talk about the principles of shooting a sun spike. And there are a number of things we need to do to prepare for that. So the first thing we need to do is make sure our lenses are really clean. When we shoot towards the sun, when the sun hits our glass, it'll pick up any sort of dirt on the lens and it'll create a lot of flare. The cleaner the lens, the less flare we'll have. So if we can clean our lens beforehand, that's great. The second thing we need to do to capture a beautiful sun spike, which will also exaggerate that noise on the lens, is we have to use a smaller aperture, and that's actually a higher number. So anywhere above 16, 17, 20, 22, you're going to get those longer sun spikes. And you can see that on these example images of the Horseshoe Bend. You can see at f4, we didn't get a very long sun spike and the sun looks kind of soft. But when we go all the way up to f22, we get those beautiful long sun spikes. Another thing to take into consideration when trying to capture a sun spike is that not all lenses are equal. Some lenses produce these beautiful long sun spikes. Some produce sun spikes with lots of different spikes coming out of them. The 14 to 24 Nikon lens does an okay job. Sometimes it captures nice sun spikes, sometimes not. If you use something like the Canon 16 to 35 f4, that does an incredible job at capturing sun spikes. And for me, that's probably the best on the market for that job. So with those three things taken into account, we have to then set up our shot. So the first thing we need to do is compose our image. And of course, we'll find our interesting foreground subjects, then we'll find our background subjects, but it's really important that we know when the sun, which direction the sun is going to set or rise. And I use something called PhotoPills on my phone. And essentially when I go into PhotoPills, I can open up the app, I can go to augmented reality, and I can basically take the shot of my image and it will show me where the sun is setting or rising, as you can see on your screen right now. And you can see the sun is rising just left of that big rock, according to PhotoPills. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. We'll see how it pans out. So essentially this is the scene that I've shot. I've decided to compose it with these beautiful cactuses either side of it, framing the image, and we've got these mountains in the background. One final thing, when we shoot sun spikes, sometimes the sun is going to hit the lens really quickly and it's going to cause a lot of flare like we mentioned before. And yes, cleaning your lens can reduce that flare, but it won't completely remove it. The easiest way to do that is to take a photo of the scene and with the sun spike and also the flare. Then when you take another shot, this time put your finger in front of the sun. And by blocking out the sun, you'll completely eliminate the lens flare. Then you can layer the exposures in Photoshop and come up with a perfectly clean image. And I'm going to show you how to do that in the post-processing part of this tutorial, which is coming up next. Before we move on to processing the sun spike image that I got from Cofa Mountains, I just want to talk about a couple of things. Firstly, I talked about removing lens flare by putting my finger in front of the sun, and you're going to see exactly how that works. But let me just talk about how I actually did it. Well, firstly, I bracket my exposures just as I normally would. So when the sun is in the right position and I've got the settings right, I'll bracket my exposures and it'll be a wide range of brackets because, you know, we're shooting at the sun. It's incredibly bright. We want to try and expose for it to some degree. Then as soon as the brackets are finished, I put my finger in front of the sun. I can see it on live view and I just bracket again. And the reason why I bracket, there's two reasons why I bracket the second set of brackets with my finger over it. And that's because, firstly, I don't know which exposures I'm going to use in my final image yet. So I don't know what I'm going to use with the original exposures or with the ones with the fingers. So I need to have a good range of options for the final image. And secondly, when the sun's coming down, it can be just at the right spot for that sun spike. And when I finish bracketing, I have to be really quick to fire off another set of brackets in order to capture the sun in the right position. If I have to take off the bracketing option and, you know, set my camera, while I'm taking the time to do that, the sun's going down and we're losing the brightness. So I want to do this really quickly, shoot off my normal brackets with all the lens flare, and then shoot off another set of brackets with my finger in the way. And another thing I want to suggest as well, sun spikes are usually best when the sun is right on the corner of an object. So, you know, if it's on the side of a mountain, just half peeking out, or if it's on the horizon peeking out, often not only do we have reduced lens flare because the sun isn't so strong, we get these gorgeous spikes coming over the sides of these objects. So try to wait for the sun to come down to that area. And again, we often get the best spikes when we're shooting at a smaller aperture or higher f-stop. So we're looking at apertures of f16 all the way up to f22. So you have to experiment with your camera and your lens to see which gives you the best results. Now let's look at the brackets I captured from Kofa Mountain and let's talk about this a little bit. And this is our base exposure, as I mentioned in the previous video about choosing which exposures for our final image. This image, if someone said to me I was only allowed one photo to work with and that's it, which one would it be? It would be this one, because it's got a lot of information in it. It's not too overexposed, it's not too underexposed. It's probably the ideal image if I had to edit this without any other exposures. You see, I've got quite a lot of information there. Now, for my darker exposures, I have a dark exposure here which exposes for most of the sky, as you can see, but the sun's still strongly overexposed. But to bring back some of that sun there, we've got an even darker exposure here, and that's just going to bring back a little bit of that area. Naturally, we still want the sun to be nice and bright because that affects the overall mood in the scene. Now, going back to our base exposure here, we have lens flare along the bottom corner here, and also, if we just move along, a little bit of lens flare here that you probably didn't see. Now, to get around that, we simply, as I mentioned, put our finger in front of the sun. And now look, we have no lens flare there and no lens flare there. So all we need to do is blend these two exposures together and we'll be lens flare free. Now, the reason why I've chosen this exposure here is because it's the exact same exposure as this image here. They're exactly the same. So if I just blend them together just by manually masking, like you'll see, they'll go together perfectly. Now, the one with the finger does actually have better light as well. The sun is just touching the top of the cactus here. I'm not sure why, because they were shot right next to each other. So they should be the same, but they're not. But nevertheless, that's worked out even better for us. Now, in terms of processing, so if I select all, I've already added a little bit of extra warmth here. So the scene originally was a little bit colder. So I added just a little bit of extra warmth because obviously it's the desert, it should be a little bit warmer. And now I just go to lens corrections and I choose remove chromatic aberrations and enable profile corrections. And I hold down shift and open the objects in Photoshop. With the images in Photoshop, I'll open up Instamask and just stack them all and I make them nice and big. So our exposures are in the right order. We've got the darkest exposure on top, the second darkest exposure under that, and then our base exposure, and then the exposure with the finger. But I always have my base exposure as the bottom exposure. Now, this is the easiest process. All we need to do with the exposure with no lens flare is to go down and put a mask on it, but we're going to put a black mask on that exposure. So we hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac and just click on the mask icon. Now, we make sure we have our brush selected, our foreground set to white, and an opacity of 100, and we just start to paint in the foreground from this exposure. And I'm going to paint in even where the fingers are there, and then I'm going to change my foreground to black and just paint these areas out here. So since these exposures are almost identical, it's a very easy process to blend them. And as you can see, there's no more lens flare in our photos. It's completely clean. Now I just want to blend in my darker exposures. So if you're an Instamask user, I'm just going to open up Instamask and let's say we go to a Brights 2. And that should give us a pretty good selection actually. That's selecting most of the sky and not much of the mountains in the foreground. Then I press select, black M for a black mask. Remember I made the dark exposure invisible when I ran that. Make it visible again. Close this, press Command and H or Control and H and set my foreground to white for my paintbrush. Put the opacity at 100% and just start painting in the sky from the dark exposure. There we go. Then we don't need to do that again. I think that looks pretty good. And now we press Command and D or Control and D, and that'll deselect the active selection. And now we want to bring in some of the darkest exposure for this area here. So I'm going to make that invisible. I'm going to press IM, and I'm going to choose a brights, let's say a brights 3 this time. And that's given us a good selection of that area. Press Select, Command and H to hide the marching ants, black mask, make that layer visible, and I'm going to paint in this area in the darker exposure. And I'm just going to paint all the way across the sky so we've got some consistency. And I'm going to do a little bit more on this area here. And when that's done, I'm going to press Command and D to deselect the active selection and just bring down the opacity a little bit so we don't get too much of a darkened area around the sun here. So that's the before and after. And we don't want the sky to be too dark. Obviously we want to recover it, but we don't want it to be unnaturally dark. Now you might not have noticed because I used a big brush, but I think we may have affected some of the cactus in the foreground here by the blending process. So if that is the case, we can select our 2 darker layers and press Command and G to group them. And we can call these dark. Then we just create a mask on that dark group. We select a black foreground, make sure we have our paintbrush selected and our opacity set to 100, and make a small paintbrush. And there you go, we're just painting out some of those unwanted areas. So that's a lot better. So now we've gone from an image with lens flare with a really cool spike, but with overexposed areas, and we've gotten rid of the lens flare and we've blended the exposures so we have a pretty balanced image. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of local contrast to the foreground here, and I'm going to do that by opening up Adobe Camera Raw again. Now since most of the foreground is coming from the layer without the lens flare where the finger was there, that's where I'm going to make the changes. So I double click on the thumbnail of this layer, and now we've got Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to bring the clarity slider along, and we're just adding local contrast to the foreground, you see. So I'm going to leave it at about, let's say 20, and press OK. Now if you want to make sure that we're being consistent here, we should open up the original base exposure and make the same settings there as well, just to make sure. And what that's done, apart from adding local contrast to the mountain here, if I just undo it, if we look at this cactus here to the right, if I just undo those changes, you see they were a little bit flat. And now by making those changes, we've made it much more consistent over the 2 exposures. And now we've added some very cool local contrast in the foreground and in the mountains. Now there's one thing I want to show you which you might not have seen before. You may have noticed that I've got a lot of lens dirt here, and that's because I was shooting at a really small aperture, and the smaller the aperture, the more our camera, our sensor, picks up the little bits of lens dirt or sensor dust. So it's usually very easy to get rid of lens dirt or sensor dirt. We just open up a new layer and we can choose the clone stamp, and then we choose sample all layers, and let's say we clone this area here, and we can just clone out that lens dirt. Now that's really simple, and we can probably just go through most of our lens dirt like this without any problems. But sometimes when we clean our image this way, for some reason, no matter what area we choose, when we try to clone it out, it leaves a darker patch or a brighter patch, and it just doesn't look very natural. And I'm sure if you've done this before, you know what I'm talking about. But the good news is, when you've got a clear sky like this, there is a different way of removing lens dirt, and it's using something called frequency separation. Frequency separation is a process used by portrait photographers traditionally, and it's used to smooth out skin blemishes in their models. But landscape and cityscape photographers can also use it for things like this, as well as sharpening and detail enhancement. And we don't need to learn how to actually create frequency separation actions. I've already created the actions for you, so it's not really very necessary or useful to understand how to make them. But nevertheless, let me show you how it works. If you're a Raya Pro user, open up Raya Pro and go to the Finish tab. And here you have Frequency Separation 16 or Frequency Separation 8. Now I'm using 16-bit, that's what I'm working in. If you're working in 8-bit, then you'll see an 8. Now I'll use Frequency Sep 16, or you can use Frequency Sep 8. But if you're using the actions, just open up the actions dialog and go down to where it says Frequency Sep 16 or 8, depending on what you're working with. and then just press play. Now our goal here is to find an area with the dirt and just to take our radius all the way down to the bottom radius. Now we've got a Gaussian blur dialog popping up here, and it's making us blur most of our image. Now we are hoping to bring up the radius enough until that sensor dirt disappears. So I'm going to keep bringing it up, and we don't want to overdo it. We just want to keep going. And now we've pretty much removed the sensor dirt. And I think about 19 is doing a pretty good job. And then we press OK. Now the action should have finished running, so we can open up our frequency separation layers, and you'll see one called local and one called global. The global layer has all of our global information, our bigger information in our image. It has information about colors and brightness. So if I make the local layer invisible, you see it's kind of blurry. It doesn't have many details. The local layer has all of our details, all our fine information. So if we make the global layer invisible, you'll see it's a really contrasting layer. But combined together, they are the exact same image as the image we were working with. It's very clever, and like I say, you don't really need to know how it works. The most important thing to know is that when we're removing sensor dirt, we need to have the local layer selected because that's got all the fine information. And we can zoom in to our sensor dirt. We choose the clone stamp, but this time we choose current layer. Now watch what happens when I clone next to the lens dirt. You see, it cleans it immediately. However, watch what happens when I clone, let's say, an area which is really bright. Let's say this area here. And now I go down to the lens dirt, and watch this. We've removed the lens dirt and it hasn't affected the brightness. Now to show you how strange that is, if I undo that, and I create a new layer and my clone stamp and change that back to all layers, and we go back to that brighter area and clone it and then go back to our little lens dirt, watch what happens. Because we're cloning the brightness as well as the details. However, if we just clone on the local layer and our frequency separation layers, we're only affecting the details in our image. So watch if I change this back to current layer, and I select an area, say in the top right hand corner, we just clone it out without any problems at all. And the great thing is, let's say we create a fairly big brush like this on an empty patch, we can just clone out all of the sensor dirt really quickly and easily. So it's a fairly painless, quick but clean process. And that's just a little bonus. It's not really related to this tutorial too much, but it's a very useful technique for you to know in the future. Now, I'm not going to take you through every piece of lens dirt because that would be boring for you. So let's move on to the next steps. Well, I think we need to start developing a little bit more mood here. And we can do that three ways. Firstly, by affecting the contrast in the image on a global scale, on a large scale. Secondly, by dodging and burning. Thirdly, by adding a vignette. And actually, we can also possibly add a little bit of the Orton effect too. So let's start with a large contrast adjustment. I'm going to open up a levels layer. And now to develop more mood, I like to darken my image significantly, but to bring up my shadows. And I feel like that creates a little bit more of an intimate mood. When we have strong highlights, strong shadows, and stretched midtones, we have a lot of contrast, but I feel it's a little bit overwhelming sometimes. So let me show you an example of this. With the levels dialog open, I'm going to bring down my midtones significantly. But I'm going to bring up my shadows to the left quite a lot too. And then I'm going to bring the highlights along just a little bit. So here is the before and after. You see we've darkened the image a little bit, but we've also lifted the shadows. And it just takes the edge off some of that contrast. Now, if you're someone who likes the really natural look, then you probably won't like this. But if you're going for a slightly more creative, moodier feel, then this is probably a better option for you. But it's entirely down to your taste. Now, the next way to develop mood is through dodging and burning. And typically, when we dodge and burn, we often create what's known as a stamped merged layer. And this is a layer combining all of our layers so far. And we do that by holding Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E on a PC. And then we choose something like let's say the dodge tool, and we select our highlights, and you see we can brighten up our highlights. And it's a fairly easy way to do it, but it is a destructive process as well. You see, because we created this layer, we can't then, let's say, make these layers invisible and it affects the image. It doesn't, because this new layer is essentially blocking all of our changes. And this adds to a destructive process. Now, if I'm being honest, a lot of photographers, although we talk about non-destructive workflows, a lot of us actually do create non-destructive workflows to some degree, because as we're going along in our workflow, we don't necessarily know what step we're going to take next or in a few steps time, and we haven't got it exactly planned out. So every now and then we might create an adjustment which doesn't really complement a non-destructive workflow. No one's perfect, so don't feel bad if you don't necessarily have the best workflow, the cleanest workflow around. But having said that, we're not going to dodge and burn this way. I want to show you a different way. Now, another typical way to dodge and burn is through a 50% gray layer. Now, I don't really like this way of dodging and burning because it doesn't give us the control that we want. Now, essentially what we do is we create a new layer, we go to Edit, Fill, and then we choose 50% gray and press OK. And we can change this layer to either soft light or overlay. Now, the problem with that is, let's say we've got our dodge tool selected and highlights again. And look, we're brightening up this area. The problem is though, we're not restricting those changes to the highlights at all. You see, we're even affecting the shadows and midtones. It's not doing a good job. What if I just want to affect the highlights and midtones or the shadows? Well, the best way to do it, in my opinion, is through a luminosity mask added onto a 50% gray layer or just a normal blank layer. The good news is I've included an action to do this for you. So if you're a Raya Pro user, you just need to go to Enhance, Enhancements, and choose something like Highlights. And this is going to create a selection just for the highlights. So let's say we bring along the highlights like this and the midtones, and we're just creating quite a contrasting mask to try and target just the tops of the cactus here. So when we press OK, now we have a really targeted mask. And so if I paint on this layer with, let's say, a paintbrush with a white foreground, you see we're only affecting the areas in the mask. We're not affecting too many of the areas around it. It's a much more concentrated selection. Now, if I just undo that, if you're not a Raya Pro user and we go into our actions, you'll see something called Highlights D&B or Shadows D&B. And each one of these will help us select that specific range. So if we go to Highlights D&B, press play, this same dialog pops up and we can bring the midtones along and also the highlights a little bit. And then we can press OK. So we've created our mask. Now we want to paint in these areas. So we have a paintbrush selected and our paintbrush set to white. But when we do that, you see we take out some of the color from the cactus. And that's not really what we want. We want them to have a nice warm color. So what we can do instead is dodge and burn with color. We can choose our foreground color like this, and we can select a color on the cactus that we want to use to dodge and burn. Once we've selected that color, we can press OK. Now watch what happens when I paint over the cactus. See, it's brightening up with that color. And again, we're just doing it around here and at the bottom. And I'm just going to do it on different parts of the cactuses here. So that's before and after. And if we change this layer from soft light to overlay, we have an even stronger effect. Now I'm actually going to paint outside of the cactuses as well, just on some of these rocks, just to brighten them up and warm them up a little bit. There we go. So this is what the before and after looks like for the dodging and burning. Now let's see if I can paint in any other areas. And we're only really affecting the upper midtones and the highlights. We're not affecting the shadows in here at all. And we've given the cactuses much more contrast, and it has made a big difference. And let's say if you wanted to select the shadows and you wanted to say dodge the shadows, for example. Well, we could go into Shadows D&B and press play. And now we only want to affect the shadows, so I'm going to bring this along all the way make it much more contrasting. And then once we've got a really good selection of our shadows, we press OK. Now watch what happens if I choose a white paintbrush and paint in the shadows. Watch this. Look, we're brightening the shadows up. And we're not brightening any of the other areas around there up at all. So if you want to brighten up your shadows in the future, if you want to bring back your shadows, then you can do it this way, and you can bring down the opacity. And you see, we're kind of adding some extra details, bringing out some extra information in those shadows there. Now, I don't really want to do that for this image. That was just a quick demonstration. The next step to developing mood here is possibly with an Orton effect, a very subtle Orton effect. And that's where we create kind of a soft, dreamy feel in our photo. Now, if you're a Raya Pro user, you have 4 different Orton effect options, so you can choose whichever works for you. I'm going to choose the first one, and it's just called Orton effect. And you see, we've got the settings already more or less set to how I like it at 44, and just press OK. And now we've got a levels dialog, and we can bring this along, and we can bring the shadows along, and just press OK. And now we've got a really dreamy image, but obviously it looks fake. It looks incredibly fake, actually. So I'm going to bring down the opacity quite a lot to around 12%. And that's before and after. And you see, we're just softening the image a little bit. Before, it's a little bit harsh with contrast, but now we're just making it a little bit softer. If you're not a Raya Pro user, let me show you how we can do this. We can press Command, Option, Shift and E, or Control, Alt, Shift and E, and create a new layer with all of our layers combined. Then we can go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and I like to use around 44 radius. Press OK. Then I bring the opacity down to around 12%. Then I press Command and L or Control and L to bring up the level slider, and I can just bring especially the highlights along and press OK. So that is the before and after. We just got a nice soft glow. So now the final way to deepen mood is through a vignette, and this is a manual vignette that we're going to create. And what we want to do here is kind of darken around the image and focus, so brighten up the foreground with the cactuses here. So we're pushing the viewer towards these cactuses because they're more interesting than pretty much anything else in the image. And we can do that by opening up a curves layer and bringing down the upper midtones. And then maybe bringing up the shadows if it gets a little bit too dark, just a little bit. And we press Command and I or Control and I. So we make the mask on the curves black and therefore the layer invisible. We make a relatively big paintbrush and we just paint around the area that we want to darken. Now I'm going to change this brush to a 50% opacity for the sky because we don't want to darken the sky too much. There we go. So that's the outer border, but we haven't actually pushed the viewer towards the cactuses yet. To do that, we press Command and J or Control and J and duplicate the curves layer. Then we press Command and I or Control and I to invert that mask. So now it's the complete opposite of the previous mask. But we change the brush opacity to 100% and the foreground to black. Make sure I've got all the sky masked out here. We don't want it to be affected. And now we open up the curves and you see it's still the same curve as previously, but this time we want to brighten it up because we're brightening up the foreground a bit. We can bring the contrast down again. And now when we're done, we can close that. And here is the before and after. So we've got a relatively balanced scene, but we're not pushing the viewer to any part of the image. And we want to push them towards the cactuses here. The best way to do that is to direct them with the brightness in our image. And we've done that with this manually created vignette. That's after, before, after, before, after. You see, that makes a really big difference in controlling how we perceive the image and where we look. So to have a look at the final image and all the changes we've made, I'm going to select all these layers and put them in a group. And this is the image we started with a highly overexposed sky, some lens flare, not really much mood. And now we've brought back the sky. We've dodged certain areas to make them brighter. We've created a nice vignette. We've softened the contrast to give it more mood. And now we're directing the viewer's eye right to the center of the image and to the foreground where these cactuses are. So we've made a huge difference in just a few steps, and the simpler our workflow, the better the final result usually is. So just to remember a few things when it comes to shooting sun spikes. We need to shoot at small aperture or a high f number, usually between 16 and 22. Using photo pills, we can plan where the sun's going to be long before it gets there. It's best to wait for the sun just to touch the corners of objects or the horizon so you get partial amount of sun coming through to the camera. It's best to bracket a wide range of brackets to cover all the light in the scene, and then to put your finger in front of the camera and block the sun to stop any lens flare. If you do that and you do it right, sun spikes are generally quite easy to capture. And if you follow the steps you've seen in this video, they're also quite simple to process.